time passage involves something changing over time. It almost presupposes an observer, which assumes consciousness exists, and the only way to perceive time is by movement of objects, essentially, or degradation of objects over time. It just seems to me like will is like it has to exist in order for consciousness to exist. I mean, you can't have a conscious system, a conscious agent environment causal relationship, or deterministic relationship without this passage of time, without this changing over time, which implies something's changing, and there's something probably that as outside the changing, that observing the changing and calling it changing, you know, and it just seems like consciousness might force will and free will to really truly exist. Otherwise, you would have no. Oh, that's a really weird thing to say, but it seems like.
I actually think there's a paper I'll send you. I think you just re-derived in maximally compressed Helmholtz's critique of Kant, actually. So like Kant is talking about these preconditions for judgment or making sense of things, of like space, time, and cause. And then Helmholtz is saying that these don't make sense out of an agent choosing things in the world, navigating a world, and that basically helping to actually in some ways co-construct these categories of space, which are both like preconditions for its agency to be able to make sense of things, but where the reason it's trying to make sense of things is for the sake of this agency. And so this like enfolding of consciousness into value as inherently mutually entangled from the beginning, I think that's absolutely right. And yeah, and Helmholtz agrees with us.
We're kind of having before, if it's not too much of a jumping under the deep end. But last time we kind of stopped right at the crux of talking about good and evil overall, kind of when we were talking about the chapter of Job and all that. And I've been reading a lot lately of Augustine of Hippo, Saint Augustine from back in the Middle Ages. And I just finished up his autobiography, particularly called The Confessions. And I came across something in there that kind of brought me back to this discussion we were having, which, long story short, is he's getting at the crux of evil throughout his spiritual journey. And he documents that directly and autobiographically pretty well. And it seemed like to me, he kind of came to this conclusion that there was a deep connection between free will and the existence of evil. And I found that pretty interesting, because the way that he came about this discovery was he was essentially trying to get to the crux of why he would do bad things when he had no desire to do them. So what his incident that he recounts in a book is he and his friends, when they're younger, break into an older person's house and go to their garden and steal some fruit. And then later he reflects on this deeply and comes to the conclusion that there's no reason that he stole this fruit from this garden other than he enjoyed the bad aspect of stealing. For some reason, he had no desire to eat the fruit. He had no desire by which to like do anything with the fruit. There was no need. And so I found it kind of quite just a deep reflection he makes in his book on this one event. It ends up affecting his entire life. And he kind of presents it as, oh, my turning away of my will must habituate into my personhood or something, this habit of stealing. And then it starts to get, so basically he comes to this conclusion on the origins of evil being basically directly proportional to free will. As you choose what's not the highest good, it begins to kind of monopolize your will in a way where you get a pleasure type thing from will. And so he was kind of trying to get at this nature of will and choice being kind of the origins of what's good and what's evil kind of thing. And to abbreviate all of that, I just wanted to see if anything I said there kind of would help further the dialogue on evil and good and free will as it pertains to that.
I mean, a lot. We could go a long time with that.
Yeah, I know. I guess so. Yeah, it's hard to isolate it. I guess I was
trying to dive in and work our way through together. So some of the things that are coming up with that, so this will be loosely associative, in no particular order, but one is wondering about the nature of the pleasure, like wondering about like words like mischief or mayhem, or but like mischief is a kind of like pleasure or small. It seems like the connotations I know of, it's fun, a kind of play, but I wonder if maybe that could have been a more serious business historically, in terms of like veering from a certain straight and narrow that people needed to maybe cleave more closely to. Maybe we still do, but that it's like a kind of like, I think of mischievousness, though I think of like playfulness and exploration also. So it's like you want a set of rules to hold you, because you want to be bound in some ways. You don't want all degrees of freedom. You'll actually, in some ways, like quickly undermine your degrees of freedom if you're not careful with the way you use them. And so it's like you want a certain playfulness and open-endedness, but you don't want to stray too far from the path of where you want to be. Okay, so that's like some things that are coming to mind. Also, other notions of like free will and good and evil, both in terms of you grant this capacity for a certain type of certain types of agency and autonomy, and part of the deal is you'll now have to deal with just structurally undesirable things will come along for the ride as part of the price. And then the other things that are coming to mind is notions of the kind of, I guess, love that God wants for us and maybe we want from each other, in terms of involving like a certain type of choice and freedom, where it's like you're not compelled, but you give it freely. I don't fully know how to make sense of that in some ways, in terms of like, if you just is that to give without reasons, or is that to give where you're driven by reasons that are your own? Like not compelled, like love me, but like just has to come from you in an organic way. It's okay. I don't. We could keep going, but so those are some things that came up, and and then other things to talk about though would be like the nature of preference as stated or revealed, the ways in which you can be at like purpose or cross purpose with yourself, and cultivating yourself across time. So it's like, how much choice would you have in any given moment, and how much choice would you have in terms of shaping the way like the metaphor of the elephant and the rider, like training the elephant to be more in line with the rider, or getting the right arrangement of like the Plato's like charioteer and the horses like together.
Yeah.
So anyway, so those are, but that's what came up for me.
Yeah, no, that's kind of how I was trying to follow the thread of what we were kind of speaking on before in a non-abrupt way, but I kind of was abrupt, and I like a lot of what you said, especially at the beginning too, kind of how you said how we want and desire some sort of structural way of exist. Like you said, rules. We almost long for rules in a way that we may not be aware of, so to speak. I think like we desire this freedom and this ultimate freedom of choice, but yet we derive a lot of our comfort from rules. And so I've heard sometimes like people analogize this with the notion of video games, and how somebody was postulating on the idea of why people get so engrossed in video games recently. And they were comparing it with what kind of the postulate you just laid out, which was this notion of like wanting and desiring a certain level of freedom, and sometimes more freedom than we really know what to do with, and don't understand how much we derive. And so the video game thing was like how you extend your cognition into the video game's character, because you can be a part of the society, obey the rules in the video game, and get the good rewards by doing that. And so a lot of times people don't find a meaning structure or a value structure in their regular life, and the rules aren't as clear and like concise to them. And so the video game gives you an exact set of rules, how you can proceed through it. And if those rules were all stripped away, you'd be in an open sandbox of mayhem, like you can choose to do in Grand Theft Auto, run around and kill people, or you can actually try to be a good criminal and start selling drugs, and you can try to start following the rules of the streets. and your character or agent can then, you know, so it's like there's a weird connection between, like you said, degrees of freedom and how much freedom are we as somebody desiring. And so I think that's interesting, the notion of that, like wanting a rule. And another thing that Augustine mentions in his, when he captures this moment in his life, is he reflects on it pretty decently about how he comes to the conclusion that he also he would never have done that act of stealing that fruit. There was no purpose, no need, but he got an enjoyment from the evilness of it, is what he came to the conclusion. And then he ended up saying later that he also thinks he wouldn't have done it if he was alone without his friend group. And he's like, so there must have been something from the prospect of bringing the fruit back with my friends and laughing about how we just took the goods from somebody else. And he's like, he got reward and laughter and all of this from the actual act of stealing because he had people to do it with. And so I don't know what really crux if he got to at the end of this, except that the overarching power of original sin from a Christian standpoint is always in the fallen existence of a human. So it's like, you may do this act of stealing this for no reason because you're indebted already from birth with the original sin that pulls you towards that. And that's where that comes from, or something like that. But also, like you said, the chariot and the rider works well with this because it's the higher self operating the chariot. Like in the Hindus, the Bhagavad Gita lays out the chariot with the charioteer, and the horses represent the senses. And the senses have to be reined in by the charioteer holding the reins, but the reins represent the mind. And so I think it's kind of that internal struggle either way. It's like you're struggling with a fight against something, some urge to do something that you should not do, but you do it anyways. And that could be something about like the horses getting before the cart, or the charioteer losing his grip on the reins. Yeah. So I was seeing, what do you think about that?
It's always hard to know. It's always hard to pick with you, but I'll just go anywhere, and we'll just keep redirecting.
Okay. Okay.
So one place, still is like getting like the nature of that like pleasure, and at doing bad because it's bad, and so like thinking of like some like I guess debates like in philosophy, like is it even ever possible to truly want to do the bad, or do you actually like construe that as being part of some sort of greater good? That's seems like that's like, you know, assuming a certain like logical and kind of propositional coherence that we may or may not have.
Yeah.
But I think that's an interesting issue. But there's a notion of psychological reactance, which is like when someone tries to control you in some way or get you to a position. A lot of people will sometimes have this like automatic like no, and they'll push towards the opposite. Dostoevsky, I think, talks about this in The Brothers Karamazov. Like, I think it's part of Ivan's speech. Like, it's like, you know, also like a Vonnegut thing, like player piano, but like,
yeah,
it's like a kind of like automatic. So even though like we're kind of like we jump the gun right into the ways in which, for instance, paradoxically giving up some freedom can give you a deeper freedom because of this like but there's still a sense in which you have to protect your freedom. And so I'm wondering, like, is the pleasure partially like it's bad but then it's okay, and there's this sort of like gradient of like an initial like excitement, but then like it's okay because you're there with the group, or it's okay for what other reason? Like some sort of like you let go of the worry. Is it almost even like you enter into a different state of consciousness at some point when you do bad, and there's almost like a pleasurable dissociation? Or is it a feeling of like, is it a feeling of hyper agency or a lack of agency? Like, I don't.
That's
like,
an interesting point, actually, taking it there on its own. Yeah, that's interesting because for a lot of reasons, really. But yeah, it could, is it that you're, yeah, are you exiting a level of consciousness that normally would be resonating at a higher frequency, so to speak, or at a different, what you would be operating from a point of virtue, a point of intentful good to do good, and then your frame shift to where you're lower, you're going toward away from what's good for so long, even if say you did a bunch of acts for a while that were obviously immoral, but you continue to do them over a period of time, you would habituate them. And that habituation of immoral action begets further immoral action into an abyss, because it has this agency that kind of takes over you. As you ingrain things into habit, I think then it becomes when you're operating at a lower level of consciousness or a different stage of consciousness, you may not even become meta aware of that because you've kind of habituated yourself so much away from the good. And I think, yeah, your consciousness could be impaired in some way or another if you're looking at it teleologically or theologically, like if you're in this relational thing from ultimate, what we are now, to objective reality, whatever that is, a God or however you frame it, as you turn away from that or as you turn towards it, either way, habits become somehow ingrained into your actions. And I think that it is reasonable to assume that your way you look at the world would certainly degrade over time too. If you habituated certain actions, maybe then you start operating at a level where you want to do that because that's the road you've chosen. And there's not a lot of exits left on it once you've gone down it too far. And what you just mentioned there, I just wanted to say about the Brothers Karamazov. That's so wild you mentioned that because I just finished that book. And that was amazing. Novel. I mean, that blew my mind.
Viewed Ivan as a role model, and a later me would have compassion for younger me, or try to, as being somewhat confused. Although Ivan did have a point, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And it's such an
as a kiss.
It's like a meta story, really, when you read a book by Dostoevsky, or I can't say his last name, but Dostoevsky.
Yes.
It's like you're reading like a meta story, like a story that precedes all stories. Like you're almost reading like a biblical version of fiction narrative, because it carries the archetypes of people in it so subtly. I just really enjoyed it. But back to what I was saying, yeah, mainly it seems like there is something to that let your frame shift, or what you find salient in your landscape, as John Vervaeke would say, is significantly altered by your relationship with reality. And I think what you perceive as salient and what you perceive as important and attention worthy in your environment, as you give that time, it becomes you in this co-creational type of way. Like your consciousness is directly related to the way that you relate with the world. And as you relate with it in a poor way, it just becomes habit. And then that habit becomes self-deception to a certain extent, that you're operating autonomously, but not in a weird way.
Good or bad, it'll become habit. I wonder, like, is it, so in terms of these different forms of pleasure that could come from violating a norm, like, so in this one model, it's kind of like, and they're not necessarily incompatible, though they might be, is like, there's the initial pain of the fear of going against the necessary heuristics by which we get along in the world, and rules and principles. And so there's an initial fear of going off, both because an ambivalence about the unknown, and also, by that stage of life, you should have gotten the memo. It doesn't always go well, and we actually even have oftentimes like punishment mechanisms in place. We restrict the payoff matrix of the games.
Yeah.
So for both better and worse. And so then it's like, okay, so there's an initial like, oh, anxiety. I don't know how bad this is, but then it's like, oh wait, it's only a small crime. It's only a little sin, and my friends are there too, so it's okay. And so like that's sort of like the gradient that's being like written down, and that's like the wee as you go, from that state of anxiety to releasing it. Maybe even with some laughter. Like I have a model of humor that I would like someone to liberate me from, because it's weird. That I have enough weird beliefs that all humor potentially might actually be the feeling of anxiety rapidly leaving you. It's actually that contrast, that transition between I'm afraid and anxious to and that's actually the quail of it. I don't know if that's true, but since a lot of the exceptions people will say are like, oh, puns. But not everyone does puns, and even then, they're not always like the pinnacle. It's like the puns are a subtle thing.
Say that again real quick. You said that comedy is anxiety doing what? I find it really interesting.
And comedy as the feeling of anxiety being rapidly reduced. So I call it like rapid anxiety relief, or RAR theory.
I think that's awesome. And also I think that that is really neat, just because truly I find I like two of the things that I like are comedy and podcast and dialogue. For some, I mean, that's why if I'm going to listen to something, it's not usually TV or anything. It's generally one of two things. It's two or three particular comedians I like. And the reason that I enjoy it is because those two comedians do particularly well at exploiting that avenue of comedy very well. The utilization of like self-mockery and self-laughing at themselves as a conduit by which they exhaust their anxieties that are that held them down in their earlier life. Even as they describe it, they are able to like admit to the public, like, when I was 25, I did this stuff, and make it into a joke, and they feel guilt about it. And simultaneously, though, it's like a public relinquishment, and you can do it in the situation of comedy, because comedy is about taking some serious, taking some bad, taking some good, and making it into some sort of long explanation with funniness. And so I think that's a pretty cool take you have, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I'll send over I only wrote it as like a very brief, like it's like 3 pages, and it's just like,
that's cool,
laying out a case. A couple other people have said some similar things. I think it's and that itself, I think actually, like I think I'm making perhaps an overly strong, but points with it, and that. So like, I think people would generally say like, okay, we all know from experience that laughing together, laughing on our own, that's a good way of like releasing tension. That's like part of letting go of fear. Like, people will acknowledge the relation. But then to say that actually like that feeling of anxiety going away is actually a kind of mirth, as a kind of release, a kind of relief even. That's actually a pleasure of letting go of something that's slightly painful, and that actually is a core part of the quail. I wouldn't say necessarily exhaustive, but maybe the idea is like that's like the heart of the melody, and that then later it gets taken up into all sorts of different forms. Not that like all humor is only about that. The way we use it is different. All the meanings are different, but that like the raw experience. Not only does humor help to like help you to release, but then it is the release, is the feeling. And not sure, but that's but some things that are, I think it's interesting the way that comedians, and people who enjoy comedy, they oftentimes do have like a good amount of anxiety, or they may not have had charmed lives, and there's also a certain like oftentimes like a certain meta awareness and like a subtlety or a quickness where they can do the reframing and maybe pull off like the rapid, like like puns. Also, like to get the humor out of puns, you have to be very semantic. Like, puns are not everyone finds puns to be punny. It's like no, right.
No doubt.
You have to have that like semantic sensitivity. So anyways, that's a kind of like, I guess I'm wondering if like part of like the joy of mischief could have some overlap there, because like there's kind of like even like a laughter with mischief. Like, it's sort of like we associate that with like you're doing the prank and then you laugh, and it's
good point.
Yeah. So then the other one was a little bit weirder, I was thinking of, and I think we could get into what even weirder. Yep, weirder. I think we're weird. I think just
good deal. Yeah. I'm glad. I mean,
existence is strange and wonderful.
Yeah, I don't know. It absolutely. The fact that we even laugh in general is odd phenomena. To be even weirder about it, I've been thinking about a lot about what laughter, even the hell laughter actually does. Why does it exist? And why would, I mean, you're saying, like you said, it's weird, but I mean, I'm making it weirder would just be what I've been wondering for a while for some reason is where the hell did it come from and why is it there?
Yeah, this whole, yeah. And it's not to insult it, it's
no, I'm very glad it does. It's just odd. It's an odd phenomena in general.
Yeah, this whole existence thing.
Yeah.
And all the modes it happens to take.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then the other like kind of way of thinking about a pleasure would be like almost like a trance state. And this is getting into like some things like meta awareness and ways in which, for instance, I don't think it. So like okay, so so earlier I was thinking of like psychological reactance of having like an uneasy relationship to authority, and I don't know all the places it comes from, but like I wonder like for instance like maybe interesting thinkers are kind of potentially like maybe pushed to the edge of where they ought to be like normatively for society, but it's actually good. Some people are kind of pushed there, and then they're like sort of broken out of usual frames and they're forced to come into a certain meta awareness. And then we talk about them because they rate things. It's like something wasn't right. They were popped out of like what would be the harmony and the flow of things. And they're like, and then they're trying to figure it out. And so then I guess what so I'm wondering whether maybe like those people might be, and this doesn't overlap with me at all, some uneasy relationship with authority, maybe, you know, yeah, so some difficulty trusting authority from, you know, some interesting experiences, you know, growing up. And in that case, like I guess so that would be like kind of like the reactance liberation. So like I'm obtaining freedom, and that's the pleasure. And I don't trust that actually the surrendering of freedom within certain contexts is the thing that will overall get me the most freedom. I don't trust that fully. And so I have like an ambivalence about this. And then it's like, but then the other kind of strange one would be freedom from yourself, freedom from your own conscience, which you might have a potentially fraught relationship to. So like if, you know, I ideally, good work if you can get it. It seems like let's say like you know, if ideally I think if the child is raised in a way where, you know, they just have this deep trust and love, it might just be like they might feel a little less temptation there. It might just be like the C major, they love it, they seek it, they want nothing more. But it, you know, oftentimes though it's even like our ideals can become like oppressors if we don't like, if we're not careful, and it's not like tempered by like compassion and like, you know, forgiveness. And so, or, you know, to go more Buddhistic with it, just like to be aware of your contingency can be a source of suffering. Just to like be aware like of how limited you are, and to be like a separate being. It's like, you know, the world is much bigger than you, and your desires are menaced, and you're going to suffer. Something like, there's different ways just to. So then the idea is like you engage in some activity that's at this edge, and there's like an excitement and a flow and a trance about it. However we want to conceptualize like different, and that this kind of fraying of selfhood could itself have like a relief like pleasure, like as you do the thing that's wrong, like the thrill of like but I don't know, so let's say someone's doing extreme sports, like how often is it, and like what is like all the phenomenology of flow states, like, you know, is it one kind of thing where you're positioned, like is it sometimes like a feeling of hyper self and like things are flowing from you and it's you and you feel there, or is it sometimes just letting go and a kind of being free of anything, or are those that different?
Yeah, no, you said I think that's interesting. Yeah, I think
phenomenology.
No, yeah, yeah, and I think that it's interesting because it's like like you said, the freedom from your conscience. That's an interesting point, just because people seek that in all kinds of ways, just in the immediate moment, you know, with alcohol and things that I like to refer to in my mind as short circuit ways to get to the flow state in a non-flow state. That's what drugs are to me, just because I've been addicted to drugs before and all that. And I was able to formulate a hypothesis around drugs in general and addiction as a way of doing that in the immediate. But then as you go forward or go on into different moments in your life and stuff like that, those behaviors become once you've short circuited the pleasure pathway in the brain, neuropharmacologically over time,
you're gonna reach for that again.
It's very difficult to get back to, because when you're getting a flow state, you're getting that, I think you're getting dopaminergic feedback, and you're getting that feedback loop rolling. And when you do drugs, it short circuits and shortcuts that to where you can get the pleasure now with the dopamine flood. And when you get like, whenever I was addicted to drugs, okay, so I would get the pleasure, the dopamine release from the drugs, so that I wouldn't need to go and do the intellectual pursuits that I do now that gives me that same thing. And getting off of drugs was a hyper realization of that for me, that I had to force my habit to repeat slowly over time, rewire and essentially that dopamine pathway. So it was like doing the things that I knew I used to love that I had lost pleasure for, forcing myself to do them again in a disciplined manner so that I could get the flow again from those activities. So it was like me trying to become meta aware of my brain and my mind and be like, oh, well, I should be liking this because this is what's good for me. But I fail to like it now because I've become so hyper adapted to getting this flow state so cheaply on the cheap end that having to go back into it. And so then it took me a while of having to force myself to do what I used to love to do, just being super aware and trying to be overly disciplined in that pursuit so I could eventually get back to the flow state that I achieved from drugs. And so I think there's just a lot of link, like you said, of escaping the conscience is something interesting. And then also like you said, like something that wakes somebody up is interesting, because it's like if you have like a harmonious worldview, like you had said, one that's flowing, one that's C major, one that's oscillating the correct frequency. That's a good point, because if you are in a certain worldview and a certain framework of being, and then something shocks the hell out of that, whether I like to think of it as a close encounter with malevolence or manipulation or trauma, just because of my background. But there's tons of ways this could occur to somebody, being shocked out of your worldview, death of a loved one all of a sudden. Maybe you never thought about death before, and then all of a sudden it's there at the door and you didn't even hear a knock or something like that. But in a lot of cases, it's like, if you don't ever go about thinking about evil or thinking about malevolence and all that, and then you see it and somebody treats you that way or something like that, and you could probably ask a lot of people who have been in those situations, and they would say, like, yeah, it wasn't so much the event itself, but it was putting the pieces back together with several pieces missing from the puzzle afterwards. That's difficult to do.
And maybe especially difficult to do if the coping strategies from that encounter, if you discovered and constructed a desire path where you basically have a fast track into rapid relief, massive dopamine, so deepening that channel, so preventing you from being able to do the things you would need to do to actually, in a more integrated fashion, heal the trauma. And which might require a much more elaborate and painful and disciplined practice making and practice. But I think it's a hard horse problem potentially. And so it's like through some combination of like relationships and your own configuration that you can basically cobble together like a concentrated enough coalition of meanings to like overcome that immediate pull, that immediate, like to bear the pain.
Excellent way of saying it.
The why to overcome the how. And it's like, yeah,
that's it. You have to find the ontology to the phenomenology to get into the, but it's like you're saying, it's the word you use, cobbling, makes the good image that I needed to see of this process, because that's exactly how it is if you're going to go ahead when you recover from drug addiction or something, or any other thing you can think of that's some other bad thing that happens to people.
Severe depression.
Yeah.
You're like crawling out of a pit, and at first you just have like a vine, and then you have some purchase, but you have on some part of you a vision of wanting to get out of it. You're holding enough that you're making use of it as part of the bootstrap, as part of cobbling together enough like hope and faith and love to get to the other side.
Absolutely. And that is with addiction and everything. I know a lot of people struggle with it, and just that's why it's most immediately identifiable to me in a situation like this. And it is kind of an interesting thing, because as you like you do have to find enough whys. You have to find, you have to have enough whys that even on the days where the one why isn't there for you, you can find some other reason that's it's still a good one, which is why in the Bible, I think it even says, like, I mean, I'm going to butcher all of this, but basically it's, you know, if one unclean spirit leaves, 7 more come home to rest in that same home. And I see that in a similar reference to this, and the way that if you don't have 7 whys to get out of bed, when you get rid of one bad spirit, 7 more will come in, because it's too hard. It's an uphill battle when you're struggling back from that. And if you just drop an addiction like that, well, you're going to find like a bunch of other addictions to do. You have to suffer. You have to pull together enough glue to bring it back.
Things like trauma will hit you twice. It'll both cause the pain you want to, you feel this need to escape for survival, but then it'll deprive you potentially of the capacity to trust enough and to visualize those sorts of complex meanings as actually being realizable. It seems like like the ultimate trauma, maybe like a lack of trust, even like it's like whatever like truly breaks your trust. And that might be some of the hardest things, like the ability to trust yourself to work towards a positive future. Like,
yeah, you're right. And betrayal is probably one of the most deep wounds that can be cut in the phenomenology of human subjectivity and the quality of experience that you can have. It's like when it gets down to mind and matter or whatever, when the rubber hits the road, what's most real? Is it the matter or is it the feeling? Because you know for a fact, like the feeling of pain, the feeling of success, the feeling of being overjoyed and feeling love, that feels to be whenever, you know, something bad happens, you'll certainly find out what's the most real, if it's the feeling or if it's the matter, you know. And I think it's like you said, there's something deeply intriguing about that idea of betrayal and trauma, and because it feels overly real.
By the matter, do you mean like the facts of the matter?
Oh no, I mean, I'm kind of like saying like in the mind matter debate, like people are saying, well, is it just idealistic? Are we just looking at the world and are we just looking at the world physically? Well, if you say it's just materialistic, well, when shit hits the fan, so to speak, you know, what are you going to feel? You're going to feel the pain, the love, the whatever.
Actually, yeah, there's a sense in which, like, yeah, what does it mean for something to be real? And one way of thinking of that is for it to be the most meaningful difference maker, the most, and you can think of it different ways, like the most powerfully explanatory, the most accessible to us. And yeah, you know, to be associated with some kind of what we might call cause. And there's a sense in which, like, the most relevant and useful causal description might not be at the physical level, but might be at a more multiply realizable and more relevant conscious level in a felt experience. Like if you're to explain what happened and what was, like, to describe like what turned your life around, it would be talking to the things you were feeling and the specific meanings. That would be the most useful and relevant description. Like with the fewest bits, I could explain the most. And that's where, like, that's where the maximal difference can happen. So there's a sense in which the feelings are the most real, in that, like, they're the most useful level of description of coarse graining reality. Like, you wouldn't talk about necessarily, like, you could maybe get some purchase if we tried to do, like, you know, your serotonin system was doing this or that, but it might not be the most relevant. It might not be the most useful, and that there is a level of organization that is operating according to its own emergent laws because of the way in which it is so configured, where those principles are the most important, or the most, you have the greatest economy of expression, the greatest predictability. But there's also, like, real in the sense of, like, what matters to us, like, and what it feels like. So it's like the feeling of, like, the pain, when it's there, nothing is more real than it. And then there's I guess that sense of, like, our consciousness as a kind of choke point or bottleneck or cause. And, like, whatever comes into our consciousness, if consciousness actually is a real pattern that has a real significance, which I believe it is, then whatever is most real to our consciousness, but actually in a way, like from like a control theory, like network control theory perspective, in a way is the most real. And so, yeah, so this like, I definitely think that, you know, mind can be, the level of mind can be more real than matter.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was saying. I don't even know why I went that direction with it. I guess it was because I was trying to figure out, or trying to think about the subject we were talking about, but I got onto that just because.
I've been thinking about that in terms of like free will also, because like a lot of these debates, like I'm trying to describe, sometimes I think of as like the varieties of what Dennett calls the varieties of free. I have mixed feelings about Dennett, but the varieties of free will worth wanting, or to like use like a Neil Seff's language, like the real problem of free will, rather than just like do we or don't we have it, like the mechanisms of it. But those exist on their own like order of being. Like what are the levels at which we choose actions? What are the levels at which we plan and reflect and have capacities for influence and to pursue values on different scales, and like that being like the real problems of free will. But the other issue though, like sometimes people just like come in like, well, determinism, you know, no free will because determinism. And so I think this kind of idea though that we might be begging some questions when we say the real, and actually it's a more flexible, like it's not that anything goes, but it might, but that some of that there's a sense in which reality is a construct, and that what we think and that we don't always know exactly what we mean, and that we're actually appealing to some sort of causal analysis, which might be fairly complicated. I mean, so there's other like kind of definitions of real, like real is what Philip K. Dick said, like reality is what doesn't go away when you stop believing in it, or something like this. And so that's where you're like appealing to greater objectivity. But, and so you say, well, what's the most subjective thing? Well, then it's like physics, and it's Laplace's demon, and it's this view from nowhere, and it's just like this big vector field. We can all agree on that. I don't know about that, actually. I don't know, actually, because if you keep going with that, if you actually go to Laplace's demon, you're actually, it's not clear there is an ontology even. There's no things, there's no kinds. It's like, it's that of which we cannot speak, and maybe we should remain silent. It's like, even to try to talk from the view from nowhere, from like that perspective where everything's determined, matter is real and the whole thing is fixed based on the matter, we're actually doing a kind of category error. We're actually mixing our ontologies mid-explanation. It's like we start with one meaning at the beginning of a sentence, flip by the time we got to the end of the sentence, but it's not the same meaning anymore. It's actually maybe literally, eliminative determinism might actually be literally nonsense. It might actually be just like it doesn't parse.
I think you're on something with that, with a lot of what you're saying. But yeah, I got you there 100%. I think that it paradoxically somehow just completely annihilates itself. Materialism in general as a philosophy, to me, as a worldview in itself, seems to be the most self-refuting cyclical animal in the phenomenology, philosophy of mind community, to say the least.
Which aspect of it? Are you talking about limited materialism, or
just the idea that quantity, like to use Bernardo Castrov's language, it's just what sunk it in for me one day, and it's just a small thing he said, but he's reiterated it now since then, and it's this notion that quantities have to precede qualities. And I'm not fully idealistic in that quality is all there is, and qualia of experience is the ground, so to speak, of reality. But I definitely think that the whole Descartes flip to where spirit separate, body separate, there's two substances, whatever. Then it went to completely, there's one substance and it's all material. And this notion that everything that's quality about the universe had to come about through a preceding set of quantities of something else. It's like, no, I think quality might drive the quantities and it co-creates themselves in the universe. But that's what materialism really is it's saying that if I see that cup there, well, there had to be a cup preceding it, and there had to be blue before there was blue. And it's like, which came first, the blueness of the cup or the cupness of the cup? But it's just the notion, this inverting idea where you don't even know that you're thinking in it. At least when I reflect back on before I had any hope for meaning in life and was nihilistically atheist, which that's fine to be that way. It just wasn't fine for me, I don't think. And so I'm glad I don't see it that way anymore. But when I did, it was, and I respect the worldview in the sense that it can be highly defended. I just don't like it. But it seems like you're trying to extract all reason and all cause, and then say it. Basically, the reducible aspect of it too, to me, is so annoying. The irreducibility of something that's made up of many parts can't be any more as a whole than it can be as a part. And the complete, why can't it not be? Because every time you've got multiplicity from unity in any segment of chemical, causal, biological evolution, there's magic there. An emergent is another word for magic to me in the science field.
I mean, there's some examples of just like wholes greater than some of their parts, which are like, because I have 5 fingers here, they afford a certain graspability of this. And no single finger could grasp it just so. But because they are brought together into a new whole, this very hand is a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. It is, and by most senses of things, it is real, very real. Oh, hands don't exist. There's just fingers and palms. No, they both exist. They both are, and some.
I know what you're saying. I feel you on that.
As a whole exists a lot more than No, it's just the cells. Well, no, if I took these cells, I put them in a Vitamix, they would not have the same affordances that they do brought together just so. They're their own sui generis new thing in the world.
Yep. Yeah. No, you're right. That's an annoying part of it to me, is this I don't know what I want to call it, but like a strictly physical materialist, a pseudo-deterministic, materialistic, physicalistic view of everything being just a sum of its parts, but the whole having no more prominent place in perception. And how do we even perceive things? Are we perceiving the object? Probably not. We would be probably perceiving the meaning of the object. Like people use the cliff experiment, the visual cliff or whatever, with the baby, and it's crawling along, and it's a little baby, so it doesn't know anything, and so it somehow knows that the cliff is a place where it will fall off, but it doesn't know that it's a cliff. It has no vocabulary. It has no idea of what falling is, but the baby knows that if it goes towards that thing, it's a falling off place. So instead of perceiving it as a cliff, it's perceiving the meaning of what falling off of a cliff means first before it ever puts a word to it. And that's just, I don't know what that has to do with this, but for some reason that came to my mind. But it seems like
there's a sense in which, like, so if our perception, I think this does speak to the idea of, pretty strongly actually, of like our perception as structured by affordances, and the way in which like our valued engagement with the world, it's not a separate thing for, it's like we're a detached observer, kind of like the bad kind of Cartesian intuition is like, I am separate from it, perceiving it, and it just appears to me, and that's the impression. It's a much more active and value-driven thing to perceive or be aware of anything at all. And I've actually been wondering about like the different ways in which like affordances do get mixed into things like visual perception. So like I'm wondering, like, to extent, so for instance, like this phone thing, like to what degree is the affordance relation basically realized by like maybe unconscious routes, and that I'm likely to have certain things more or less in the foreground or background, the way I sample from it with saccades and intentionally shift, like I will actually infer a different type of object that will show up in my consciousness differently based on my history of use. And so some of this will be just like the patterns of where I sample from first, because like it's only a thumb's nail at arm's length that I got. And so I'm actually going about 3 or 4 times a second. But then there's also, I'm wondering, like a sense in which like the perception is always like interlaced with imaginings. And what are you going to imagine? Probably something affordance like that will be relevant to like the way you use it. So like I think of it this way, but then I like, might have like a very brief micro experience, micro quail of like it falling or it rotating or it grasping. And so like part of like, even though like the maybe like the bulk flow in my mind, I might not necessarily notice I'm doing all these micro imaginings. I keep coming back to seeing it. There's actually like a texture that's being added from like this sort of like penumbra of micro imaginings around it. So
yeah, that's cool. I like that. Yeah, yeah, and that's interesting because like robots, they've tried that experiment where they make them look at a blank wall with a picture frame on it, and humans can. This is coming to my mind when you said that, is that humans can perceive quickly and adequately and accurately the discrepancy between what is the background, what is the context, and what is the foreground, meaning how they have the inability to place attention on something with higher value than what it's on in order to perceive a different object. Well, that's interesting.
And then to come back to Dennett, who I have mixed feelings about, but the frame or the relevance problem, like we solve it by the way we basically bootstrap our minds from these value-driven engagements of the world, and where our patterns of imagining and attending are all structured by this. One thing I don't know if I believe this, but one thing I've wondered actually is whether in terms of like phenomenal binding and consciousness, whether actually the body itself might be one of the greatest sources of synchronous coherence in the brain, because you do in fact have a body with a lot of mutual information around it that will all vary in time and all will be strongly constraining and informing of each other, because you do indeed have a body that's coming in with this high bandwidth connection. And so
it's not an illusion or anything.
Sorry. Yeah. So one thing I was wondering is, like, when you bind something in your mind, when you reach out and you grasp it in mind, or like with your attention, where there actually is some sort of associative linkage to your body maps and a kind of chaining of rhythmic coherence that actually is helping some visual percepts to win out over others, that actually there is a pattern of effective connectivity going from like the neuronal ensembles would be the visual representation to a highly resonant set of body maps, and that actually this could help in a sort of what do they call it, biased competition models of attention. This is actually what has some things enter into consciousness. Some things become coherent more than others. And so so this would be another way in which affordances would get into the mix, because the associations between what you see and your experience of them in your body, those would be affordance relations. It would be like most of the things you would expect, they would be predominated by affordance relations for you or other embodied agents. Like, I see a thing that I normally grasp, the thing that there actually might be a set of connections going from my hands and my eyes and the way I would physically interact with it, and that these are actually biasing the competition within my visual awareness through my body. It's speculative, I know, but
yeah, and I think, I mean, you might even be aware. I mean, I may even not even have this right to begin with. What the hell? But anyways, I think what you're talking about is that the linkage of the first step of perception and with the sensory, with our sensory ability, I think this is kind of what you're saying, and then you can refine it after I'm done and see what that looks like. But I think it makes sense that it's this multi-layered perception and integration of sensory data, and then making a value judgment on that based on your previous perceptions of the world and your, relevance realization, as Vervaeke would say. I keep quoting him, but when you just talked about the problem of framing and the problem of a relevant viewpoint and realizing something as relevant is probably correct. I mean, or probably, like you said, it's probably layered, and we most probably have some kind of body response to patterns in the world versus our internal patterns, because we can map ourselves. And so maybe
that's exactly what I have in mind, like as relevant realization. I guess I'm wondering whether because the whole thing is structured by relevance realization, I'm wondering if even mechanistically this embedded interaction has so it's like Vervaeke is talking like functionally, this is how it has to be for us as cybernetic systems moving through the world.
Right. Okay, yeah, I see.
And so I'm saying yes, and I'm wondering whether though we have like another mechanistic level of analysis that's also reflected in the same way.
I see.
and so, but it's very compatible, but it's exactly Vervaeke's idea, just another level, I think.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. And the idea like that something in a visual, something visually perceived can possibly act, it can even create sensation in a different form of sense, you know, like if somebody knows a surface is like rough and they're shown an image of a rough surface, or they're asked, I think in a trial or something I had seen, maybe, hopefully this was real, they would have them touch like a ticklish object, and then they would take them in a room and do some stuff, and then they would show them that tickly object on the projector screen, and then the actual sensory motor portion of the brain responsible for perceiving that texture would activate based on their visual perception. And so I think that kind of pays some linkage to what you're saying.
That would be very consistent, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So
that study, by the way.
What's that? Oh yeah, yeah. It's in where I remember hearing it, and where I know for a fact it was where it was captured really well in comparison to contemplation and contemplative practice was, and it's really neat how it's Sam Harris's book, Waking Up, but he does in that book. First of all, it's an excellent book, but it's really just he does a beautiful way of taking that little piece that we just talked about of that study and making an entire chapter based on awareness on that kind of. And so I'll definitely send it over to you, but it's neat how you mentioned that, because that definitely pays. That's taking that experiment or that thing I remember and bringing it into a light of narrative, some way to structure it that's really neat.
A few threads kind of looped together.
Yeah.
If it works. So you bring up Vervaeke, he actually has a model of personality development via relevance realization. I may or may not have reviewed that paper, and I may or may not have been difficult. I was difficult. But it's fantastic. And it really, you actually, I think earlier in this conversation, were describing a kind of like bootstrapping of the self through this sort of iterative interaction, kind of structured by a kind of relevance realization. And so there's I guess when I'm, in terms of these different threads, in Vervaeke's thinking, so like I'm seeing these kinds of like dynamic tensions of things that are somewhat like opponent processes, but they're complementary opponent processes. Both being, so they can conflict, but they're both necessary, and they can also be synergistic. And so I'm wondering whether like relevance, meaning that which works, the Tao, if you will, that which will actually have will result in powerful, coherent flows, harmonious flows. Whether this is actually a line running through these opponencies. So for Vervaeke, he's thinking of like personality as structured by these processes that have to be in this balance, and you're shifting between them based on whatever gives you this better grip on the world, and like this better purchase. And
yeah, okay. And not to interrupt you, I was just thinking, I don't know much about his personality theory, and I'd like to learn more, but I'm following you on what you're saying though right now. The opponent processes that you're referring to, what is that? I mean, I'm sorry for my ignorance, but what does that really mean?
So there's so some of this would draw on Colin DeYoung, who actually did some good amount of this work working in collaboration with Jordan Peterson. I wrote this book chapter on personality with him not too long ago, trying to combine personality frameworks with the free energy principle. And
oh wow, that's cool.
Yeah, I can send that over to you. I think you'll be Vervaeke's paper is a better read, but I'll send mine over too.
Yeah, of course.
What I wrote with Colin. But so what the work Colin has done is he shows that personality, the big five, has a more complex hierarchical structure. And I think this is actually going to come back to free will in a way. That he interprets the big five trait domains as these parameter settings for a cybernetic system. So neuroticism would be something like your error sensitivity. Conscientiousness would be some sort of like metacognitive process of like monitoring the coherence of your goal hierarchy. and making sure it's like prioritized as you're pursuing kind of like complex and potentially hierarchical goals. Extroversion, degree of maybe reward sensitivity. Openness as sensitivity to new information as you're like figuring out what's in the world. Agreeableness as maybe reward slash hard to reduce, but like something about like a multi-agent context, the relevance of that information to you. But the idea is like, these are all things that can have different degrees of influence on our minds as things that help us get through the world and help us interface and survive and achieve goals. So, but he'll go further. So he calls it cybernetic big five theory is his personality theory. But just like the basic empirical work and the psychometrics involved was the big five seems to have a more complex structure. And that if you take each of these trait domains, beneath them, you'll get these aspects, which will have, they'll be more specific. I think we just froze. Can you hear me? I might have lost you, and you might have lost me. Although I think from last time, if I remember, you can probably still hear me. This is probably still recording, but it might not be. Forgot if this was in there. Hello? I'm back.
Sorry about that, Adam.
No problem.
I was right. I was right. Sorry. Whenever you were talking, I was. You just gotten into the part of the big five being the cybernetic over basically being that hierarchical structure by which there's multiple layers of personalities below it, or not layers of personality, but attributes below each one, and how they co-interact. And then you were talking conscientiousness being an error observer and this, that, and the other, but you were on extroversion specifically.
Oh, so you can interpret each of the big five trait domains as being relevant to relevance realization, in terms of like they are part of what helps a goal-seeking system get achieve value in the world. And so this is interpreting all personality in these terms of a being trying to navigate the world and achieve value. What's meaningful to it, where the meaning is largely about survival, what allows it to be. But the interesting thing, and so Vervaeke has a description of all this in terms of relevance realization using that's referring to the structure of personality in the big five. But so one interesting thing though about like a more complex hierarchical structure of personality is beneath each of the big five trait domains, you have these aspects, and there's two and only two. And so for something like conscientiousness, I believe it's industriousness and orderliness. For extroversion, it's enthusiasm or assertiveness. Openness, it's openness to intellect, or openness to experience or intellect. Agreeableness, it's compassion or politeness. And neuroticism, it's volatility or withdrawal. And these seem to be like modes of realizing these forms of value that can be different, and you might need them differently in different circumstances. And so you have them kind of in a state of dynamic tension with each other within each individual, who might be realizing them to different degrees overall, but across context. But then there's another interesting opponency reflected in terms of at the highest level of organization, you'll actually see these two meta traits of stability and plasticity. So stability is this shared variance of conscientiousness, inverse neuroticism, and agreeableness. And plasticity is the shared sensitivity of extroversion and openness. But it seems like there's this stable portion. So the stability idea is basically that which lets you, I guess, in some ways, stick to the straight and narrow, to your straight and narrow, to society's straight and narrow, and to build structure and coherently plan. But then the plasticity is basically part of what lets you reconfigure and discover and make the new. And so they can be in tension, and that so one can be favored over the other, but they're also synergistic in that if you're not plastic, you're not going to be able to be stable for long. You'll be brittle. You'll crumble. You're if you turn away from new things, that will only last you so far unless you're in a very cloistered environment. But also, if you don't have a stable base to move from, you can't be very plastic. You're not going to be very dynamic, and you're not going to be able to explore the new unless you have some sort of stable base to come home to. And so I guess part of the tying this back to free will is I kind of view actually free will to have a kind of multiple meanings which seem like they're contradictory, but they're actually of this same kind. So it's like we have the will, and it's like, and sometimes it's even maximal will is like minimal freedom, but it's still like good free will. It's like Luther, like, here I am, I can do no other. And like, here you are taking a principled stand, maximal will, but you cannot break free of it, or something like that. Or you're working within, some sort of game structure that's very predictable, and you're achieving your goals, and that's it. But then the freedom part is, you might want to be able to change your mind, to break free of the past, to maybe even surprise yourself, for something genuinely new to come in that you weren't thinking about. Really cool. And so I think language is wise in that while some people like ridicule people and saying like people want a contradiction in free will, I actually think, no, that's exactly what complex beings such as us need to get through this world. But this idea of like seemingly paradoxical contradictions that are actually resolved as a sort of dynamic interplay where what's running through it is relevance realization or meaning, or that which actually realizes value in the world. And so I don't know, that was the threat.
That's cool. Oh, I like that. And you know what it brings to mind to me, image wise, is the cartoon of the devil and the angel. I'm not trying to dumb this down because your explanation was brilliant, but it's the devil and the angel on the shoulder talking, and that whole cartoon-like phenomena where you've got the angel here and the devil here, and they're having this bickering argument. It's like the way you describe plasticity and the stability and the industriousness versus your efficaciousness or whatever, charismaticness. That all of those, like the black and the white wolf, miniature versions of that, hierarchically stacked up to an ultimate black and white wolf of the self that is made up of all of those things.
It's like you don't necessarily want, so you don't want to only feed you don't want to only feed the rougher wolf, but like you want to feed both wolves at least some, it seems, potentially. So like it's kind of this idea of like, is there, kind of coming back to Job and like the adversary as part of the court of, like part of the divine court, part of like a seed of chaos that's necessary as part of like a broader coherence, while at the same time not overstating it. Well, so like there's a sense in which like, so like, is it like a good distinction between like mischief and mayhem? So it's like mischief, it's still within bounds, and it's like just enough like freedom to break away and try different things, but it's like it's play and it's good. But then it's like, but it's not like a more of a hard pushing away of norms that you may not want to push away from. Something more like mayhem. I don't know if those are the best words, but
yeah, no, that's cool. I like that, man. So I think it's cool. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Sorry. What came to mind? Yeah, I think that's interesting. It's like I guess you would, like you said in Job and the divine, and it's almost like the distinction, like you said, between mayhem and chaos and stuff it's fickle.
Yeah, I don't know if those are the best words, but that's part of what I'm wondering. Like, there's like a bounds of like almost like I don't know if I say it's like a childlike innocent evil, and then like more of like that has a different karma from more of like a truly malevolent one. And I'm
Yeah,
wondering if like, stealing the fruit was kind of at that border, but just enough from the childlike one that was okay, and that was part of the pleasure.
I like it.
I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know.
No, I think you're right, man, because you had mentioned, here's what makes me think of from one of your previous statements that sticks with me that I think of sometimes is, like you had said before, one time we talked, you mentioned this brief thing about how you might be too naive or ignorant or young or immature to incorporate dark triad, intentionally malevolent traits into your arsenal of weaponized actions out in this chaotic world. And you had mentioned like maybe we're not, as a child and stuff, we're not able, because we aren't able to incorporate true malevolence into our actions. So a 2-year-old beating the heck out of another 2-year-old looks vicious. If you were like if you were a really old 2-year-old somehow and you were watching them, you would be what? But as a 2-year-old, you're like, well, that's just two kids beating the hell out of each other on the porch. One's head's bleeding. Oh, it looks normal. But if two adults are doing that, it's like, oh, they've malevolently assaulted each other. You perceive it immediately.
Ground and they heal quickly. It's still safe.
Yeah, exactly. Jordan Peterson would say they just need to be socialized and they need some rough and tumble play and they need to make their bed and they'll be good. Now, I just like to give Jordan Peterson stuff. You mentioned him earlier, so I like to throw in there sometimes because I love listening to him, but man, he hammers home the 2-year-old, 3-year-old factor and the making your bed factor quite a bit.
Some of his like battles of will with toddlers are pretty hilarious, but also like I actually I there's a lot I revere Jordan Peterson in a lot of ways.
Me too. Yeah.
I wonder if he though has a fatal flaw of not enough compassion. That basically not enough self-compassion specifically, and that like if like because like there can be like a balance of like a lack of constraints, a lack of discipline. But the second book was like, or not second book, but the most recent one, Beyond Order.
Yeah.
Not enough order, you got a problem. Too much order, you got a problem. And bringing those together as both being necessary, this dynamic tension. But I guess I'm thinking of like these power struggles, the battles of will with like toddlers. And I think it's mostly like, that is a benevolent good father. But I do wonder a little bit whether like he lets his own inner child, like, I don't know.
Yeah, there's something there.
I'm a hypocrite on this. I'm not good at this myself.
Oh yeah, no.
This part I can call him out on it. It's like I'm wondering if like, yeah.
Yeah, if I'm calling out anybody, it's always pot calling the kettle black for sure. In that sense,
this is a black kettle. So
yeah, and I'm actually the whole essence of that in that comparison. But yeah, it's quite intriguing, and I think that will ultimately. I think will. What about like what if the action and will to do an action arises directly as it's like not a byproduct of consciousness, but time passage involves something changing over time. It almost presupposes an observer, which assumes consciousness exists, and the only way to perceive time is by movement of objects, essentially, or degradation of objects over time. It just seems to me like will is like it has to exist in order for consciousness to exist. I mean, you can't have a conscious system, a conscious agent environment causal relationship or deterministic relationship without this passage of time, without this changing over time, which implies something's changing. And there's something probably that as outside the changing, that observing the changing and calling it changing, and it just seems like consciousness might force will and free will to really truly exist. Otherwise, you would have no. Oh, that's a really weird thing to say, but it seems like.
I actually think there's a paper I'll send you. I think you just rederived in maximally compressed Helmholtz's critique of Kant, actually. So like Kant is talking about these preconditions for judgment or making sense of things, of like space, time, and cause. And then Helmholtz is saying that these don't make sense out of an agent choosing things in the world, navigating a world, and that basically helping to actually in some ways co-construct these categories of space, which are both like preconditions for its agency to be able to make sense of things, but where the reason it's trying to make sense of things is for the sake of this agency. And so this like enfolding of consciousness into value as inherently mutually entangled from the beginning